You bought your childhood home back from the bank 11 months ago. Nobody in your family knows. Not your mother, who still lives 40 minutes away and asks every Sunday if you've driven past it. Not your brother, who saw it sell at the foreclosure auction 3 years ago and still brings it up at holidays like it's a wound that never quite closed. The house sits there right now with a tenant inside who has no idea who actually owns it. You drive past it sometimes. You've never once gone in. It's a small 3-bedroom on Maple Crest Drive, the kind of street that doesn't show up in anyone's plans for the future, just a quiet residential road with mature oak trees and houses built in the same decade by the same developer. The paint is a different color now, pale gray instead of the yellow you grew up with. The tenant put in a different mailbox. There's a trampoline in the backyard that wasn't there when it was yours. You know all of this because you drove by on a Tuesday evening in March, slowed the car to maybe 5 miles an hour, and looked at the house the way you'd look at a photograph of someone you used to know. You did not stop. You have the deed in a folder in your home office. You have known, since the day you signed it, exactly what you were holding. And you have told no one. Here is the part that doesn't make sense to anyone who hasn't lived inside it. The buying back wasn't the hard part. The hard part is the not telling. This story doesn't start with the house. It starts with the day they lost it, which was a Thursday in October when you were 19 years old, sitting in a community college parking lot between classes when your mother called and said the word foreclosure out loud for the first time, like saying it would make it less real instead of more. Your father had been out of work for 14 months, not from anything dramatic. The manufacturing plant where he'd spent 22 years simply closed, moved its operations to a facility 2 states away, and offered him a transfer he couldn't take because your grandmother was sick and someone needed to be near her. He took odd jobs. He took less than he was worth at every single one of them. The mortgage was $1,140 a month, which had felt manageable on his old salary and felt impossible on what came in after. You watched the letters arrive. You watched your mother open them in the kitchen and refold them along the same creases and put them in a drawer like that might slow down what they said. The auction happened in February. A stranger named a company, not even a person, a company, bought the house for $61,000. At a courthouse auction, your family didn't attend because nobody could bear to watch. You moved into your aunt's basement that spring. Your father got quieter, your mother got smaller, in a way that had nothing to do with weight. Nobody used the word again after that. Foreclosure. It just lived in the house behind whatever anyone said, the way a smell stays in a room after you've opened all the windows. You didn't have a plan at 19. You had a number. $61,000. The amount a company paid for the house your father had spent 22 years paying a mortgage on. You did the math more than once, in the way teenagers do math when they're trying to make a feeling make sense. 22 years of payments, and the house left the family for less than what some people spend on a car. You didn't tell anyone you were thinking about this. There was nothing to tell yet. It was just a number that lived somewhere behind your ribs for the next several years while you finished community college, transferred to a state school on a partial scholarship, and took a job in commercial property management that paid $34,000 a year and felt, at the time, like the most adult thing that had ever happened to you. The job mattered for a reason that had nothing to do with the paycheck. It put you inside buildings. It taught you how ownership actually worked, the layer underneath the layer everyone sees. Liens, titles, equity positions, the difference between who lives somewhere and who actually controls it. 3 years in, you bought your first rental property. A small duplex 40 minutes from where you grew up, nothing connected to your family's story, just a property that made sense on a spreadsheet. It netted $510 a month. You told your mother you'd bought a little investment property. She seemed pleased and slightly confused, and didn't ask many follow-up questions. You didn't correct the vague impression she had. You let her believe it was smaller than it was. That habit, the deliberate smallness, started long before the house. The house just gave it a reason that finally made sense to you. The company that bought the house at auction held it as a rental property for 9 years. You knew this because you checked. Not obsessively, just periodically, the way some people check old social media profiles of someone they used to date. Every 18 months or so, you'd search the property address. You watched it cycle through 3 different tenants over those 9 years. You watched the company's portfolio grow on public filing records, your childhood home becoming one line item among hundreds, completely unremarkable to the people who owned it. Then, in year 9, a real estate investment trust the company had been rolled into began liquidating a portion of its single-family portfolio all at once, 300 properties across 2 states, all sold through a single bulk transaction to clean up their balance sheet before a quarterly earnings call. You found out because you'd set up an alert, a boring, automated email notification that watches public property records for activity on a specific address. You'd set it up 4 years earlier, and mostly forgotten about it until the morning it actually fired. The subject line was clinical. Ownership transfer pending. Maple Crest Drive. You sat with your coffee going cold for almost 20 minutes before you opened the attached filing. By this point, you owned 6 properties. You had a relationship with 2 regional banks and a private lender who'd worked with you on 3 separate deals. You had, without ever planning for this specific moment, built exactly the kind of financial position that makes an unexpected opportunity executable in days instead of months. You called your lender that same afternoon. You didn't explain why this particular property mattered. You just said you wanted to move fast. The portfolio sale wasn't structured for individual buyers. It was built for institutional purchasers, other funds, other REITs, large operators who could absorb 300 properties in a single transaction and sort out the details later. Your childhood home was not, in any sense, designed to be available to you specifically. It was a rounding error in someone else's spreadsheet, and the only reason it became available at all was a clause buried in the bulk sale agreement that let the buying fund cherry-pick which properties they actually wanted and resell the rest individually, fast, to recoup capital before the deal closed. Your house ended up on the resell list, not because anyone cared about it, because it didn't fit the buying fund's target metro concentration, and getting rid of it quickly mattered more than getting top dollar for it. You found this out through a broker you'd worked with twice before, a woman named Carla, who specialized in off-market single-family transactions and had, over the years, become the kind of professional relationship where she called you first when something unusual crossed her desk. "It's a weird one," she said. "3-bed, decent shape, current tenant in place, seller just wants it gone fast. You interested?" You didn't tell her why you were interested. You told her to send the paperwork. The price was $97,000, more than the $61,000 the company paid at the original auction, but less than you would have guessed for a property that had appreciated for 9 years, in a market where similar homes were selling for $140,000 or more. The seller wanted speed more than they wanted maximum value. You had cash sitting in a deployment account, built specifically for moments exactly like this one, sitting idle for the better part of 2 years, waiting for an opportunity that justified moving. You closed in 11 days. The existing tenant, a woman named Renee, with 2 kids and a job at a regional hospital, had no idea the ownership had changed. The property management transition happened through Carla's brokerage on the back end. A standard letter went out informing her of new ownership with a new payment address. Nothing in it that would suggest anything unusual. You drove past 2 weeks after closing, slow, the way you would later make a habit of. Renee was in the front yard with her kids. A small inflatable pool set up on the grass. That used to be where your father grew tomatoes. Nobody in the family particularly liked, but everyone ate, anyway, out of some unspoken obligation. You did not stop the car. You sat in your driveway that night for a long time before going inside. Your partner asked what was wrong. You said nothing was wrong. This wasn't entirely a lie. Nothing was wrong. Something was just complicated in a way that didn't have an easy name. The rent comes in every month through a property management company that handles the relationship on your behalf. Renee has never once spoken to you. She thinks her landlord is a property management firm with an LLC name that means nothing to anyone, including, in a sense, you. You raised the rent once, by $40, in line with market adjustments your management company recommended. You felt something uncomfortable signing off on that increase that you would not have felt raising rent on any of your other 6 properties. You approved it anyway. The numbers had to make sense regardless of what the house used to be. This is the part that surprised you most. Owning it didn't feel like reclaiming something. It felt like managing an asset that happened to share an address with a memory. Your brother brings up the foreclosure at almost every family gathering. Not bitterly anymore, just as a fact that's become part of the family's shared vocabulary, the way some families have an old story about a flood or a car accident that everyone references without needing to explain. "Remember the house on Maple Crest?" he'll say, usually after a second beer. Usually to a cousin or an in-law who hasn't heard it before. Some company just snapped it up for nothing, probably flipped it for double. You've heard this version of the story maybe 30 times in the last several years. You've never corrected it. You've never mentioned the alert you set up 9 years ago, or the broker named Carla, or the 11 days it took to close, or the deed sitting in a folder in your home office, 2 miles from where this conversation is happening. Your mother still drives past the house herself sometimes. She told you this once, almost embarrassed, like it was a strange habit she couldn't fully explain. She said she likes to see that someone's taking care of it. She mentioned the new paint color approvingly. She has no idea the paint color was approved by a property management company acting on your instructions. You sat across from her at that dinner, with the deed 2 miles away, in a folder in your office, and said nothing. Not because you were ashamed, because you genuinely did not know, even sitting there, what telling her would actually accomplish. And you have learned, over years of building things quietly, that the absence of a clear reason to speak is usually a good reason to stay silent. The test of all of this arrived 8 months after closing, on an ordinary Tuesday, when your property management company called to say Renee was 4 days late on rent for the first time in the 2 years she'd been a tenant, and that she'd mentioned, vaguely, some trouble at her job. Your management company handles delinquency through a standard process. A notice goes out. A grace period applies. If it extends past a certain point, the eviction process begins, the same process that applies to every property in your portfolio without exception, because consistency is the entire point of having a management company handle this instead of doing it yourself. You got the notification email like you would for any of your 6 properties. Tenant late, day 4, standard notice issued. You sat with that email open for longer than you'd ever sat with a delinquency notice before. You thought about your father, 14 months without work, the letters in the kitchen drawer, the auction nobody could bear to attend. You thought about how easy it would be to call your management company and ask them to extend the grace period, quietly, just this once, for reasons you wouldn't have to fully explain to anyone. You also thought about Renee, who you had never met, who had 2 kids and a hospital job and no idea that the person making this decision had once stood in this exact house's kitchen watching his own mother fold foreclosure letters along the same creases. You called your management company, you told them to follow the standard process. No exceptions, no special handling, exactly what they do for any tenant in any property. Renee paid in full. 11 days later, the trouble at her job resolved itself, and the standard process never escalated past the second notice. You have thought about that decision more than almost any financial decision you've ever made, including the ones with far larger numbers attached. Not because you're certain it was the right call, because you're still not entirely sure what the right call would have even meant, and you've made peace with not having a clean answer. The deed sits in a manila folder in the second drawer of your home office desk, behind insurance documents and ahead of old tax returns, completely unremarkable in its filing location, indistinguishable by sight from the deeds to your other 6 properties. You opened that folder 11 months after closing, on an evening your partner was out and the house was quiet, and looked at it the way you'd look at the house itself, driving by at 5 miles an hour. Your name on a property deed, attached to an address that used to be your childhood bedroom, your father's tomato garden, the kitchen table where your mother once said the word foreclosure out loud for the first time like saying it could make it less true. You did not feel triumphant. You'd expected, somewhere in the years of waiting for this exact moment. That triumph was the feeling that was supposed to arrive. What arrived instead was something quieter and more complicated. A kind of grief sitting directly next to a kind of resolution, occupying the same small folder in the same drawer, refusing to cancel each other out the way you'd assumed they eventually would. You closed the folder. You put it back behind the insurance documents. You made dinner. Your partner came home an hour later and asked how your day was, and you said it was fine, which was, in its own complicated way, completely true. Here's what owning your childhood home back from the bank actually feels like. 11 months in. It feels like driving past at 5 miles an hour and never stopping. It feels like your brother telling a version of the story at Thanksgiving that you'll never correct, not out of pride, but because correcting it would require explaining 9 years of an alert nobody knew you'd set, and some explanations cost more than the silence they'd replace. It feels like a deed in a folder behind your insurance documents, completely ordinary to look at, holding something that isn't ordinary at all. It feels like approving a $40 rent increase and feeling something you don't feel on any other property and still approving it because the numbers have to work regardless of what a house used to mean. The thing nobody tells you about going back for something you lost is that the going back rarely fixes the losing. The house is yours again, technically, legally, completely. But your father still lost 14 months of work he never fully recovered from. Your mother still folded those letters along the same creases. 19-year-old you still sat in that community college parking lot hearing the word foreclosure for the first time. Owning the house back doesn't undo any of that. What it does instead is quieter than undoing. It's proof, just for you, that the story doesn't have to end where it almost ended. That the number behind your ribs for all those years turned into something real, even if nobody else ever finds out it did. This week, think about the thing from your past you've never told anyone you went back for. Not to fix it. Some things don't get fixed. Just to know, quietly, the way you know now, that you went back anyway.